everyone, it's Anna from kitandcatshop.com, and today's video is about knitting for smart doll scale. And we actually started selling our patterns, knit and sewing, on our shop back in 2019. So it's been a couple of years, 2 or 3, and we have received questions regarding the patterns, how to knit for the dolls. And I've collected those and also some hints and tips to make knitting for your smart doll a little bit easier, have some more success, and possibly interest you in starting a new hobby. So when you go to our shop and you purchase one of the Kit and Cat Shop patterns, you'll receive a PDF, and when you print it out, it will look something like this. You'll have your instructions, your materials, and tools guide, as well as variations and suggestions for different items that you could make using the same pattern. We do try to follow commercial United States publication standards. We do include in the back a little glossary of what those abbreviations are, if you're not familiar with them. So Kit and Cat patterns are actually meant to be used more as templates. I tried to design the sweaters and the garments so that a beginner can have success in making their first project for the doll and have it still look like it's a scaled down miniature version of the real thing. The patterns have also been designed so that someone who has more skills or has a little bit more experience with knitting can take the patterns and add some of their own touches to make them their own, adding color work or pattern stitches. So it's not, it has to be done exactly as you see it here. A lot of things that are going to affect the outcome or the final piece for your pattern are going to be your needles that you use, and we'll go over those, your tools, and what type of fibers that you make the piece from. Also, the patterns are meant so that you can make a variety of garments from one pattern, so that you can make the sleeves longer or shorter, you can make the length longer or shorter, so you can make a short sleeve crop cardigan or a long sleeve sweater. And another thing about the patterns is most of these are actually going to be rather loose fitting, boxy type garments. That means that they will fit, or should fit, unless I state specifically otherwise in the description of the pattern. They should fit all of the smart doll bust sizes. So to knit, you need needles. And because we are going to be doing almost but not quite the same amount of stitches we would if we were creating a full-size garment, we have to find other ways to shrink down the item. One of those is going to be the size of needles that we use. I have a collection of vintage needles that come in very small sizes, but I know that these are kind of hard to find these days, especially with a lot of the craft stores focusing on more bulky or chunky knits. So what I have found that's pretty easy to get a hold of is something called a sock needle. And usually these are sold in sets of 4 or more. And the nice part is they do come in very small sizes. Everything from like 1.25, or even I have a set here that's 0.75 millimeters. And if you can see these, they're roughly the diameter of a very thick sewing pin. Now, to find these needles, if you have a yarn store or a specialty shop in your area, they will carry these usually in carbon fiber, that's what these are, or they'll have them in stainless steel. I find that I usually like the stainless steel better. Some yarns kind of want to stick to the carbon fiber surface, whereas they'll slide more easily on the stainless steel. If you don't have a specialty or a dedicated yarn store in your area, you can check out your local craft stores. Now, Joann's, I have found, carries a set that's called Susan Bates is the manufacturer, and they sell an entire package of, it's like 5 each of each of the different sizes. And what's really nice, now these are aluminum, not stainless steel, and they have like a color coating on them. They are more susceptible to bending with use, but that usually doesn't affect their usefulness. They'll still knit just fine. If you do not have a Joann's near you, some people were able to find these online. If you do need to go online, Amazon does have some of the sock needles available. I think I actually got this one from Amazon, the stainless. I got these from the yarn store. They do carry, there's a couple of companies that carry sets similar to these, but I'll warn you, before you use those, you want to make sure you actually check the dimensions of the needles, because I found some of those cheaper sets that you get online can be off. It can say it's a 2 millimeter, but when I actually checked it against my gauge, it was closer to a 3. And I know a millimeter doesn't seem like a big difference, but when we are reducing our knitting to 33%, every tiny increment can make a difference. So for a sweater, typically you're going to want 5 double pointed needles for your item. Now, I know that seems like a lot, especially when you're only using 2 at a time, but having the additional double pointed needles will actually allow you to keep the parts of the body and the sleeves on individual needles. If you don't have 5 and you've just got 2 of each size, that's okay. What you'll want is you'll want to find some of the longest safety pins you can, or you can purchase what are called stitch holders, and they work the same way. You just slide your stitches onto it, close it, and then it keeps them secure because you're not binding off your swatches. You'll actually want to keep those on a needle or transfer them to a needle so that you can knit them all together when we go to finish the sweater. One of the other items you'll want to go with the double pointed needles are these little rubber stops. And in regular knitting, not scale knitting, these are used to keep your stuff from slipping off the end of the needle if you put your knitting down. What I use them for is kind of to replace the piece that's usually put on a regular needle. So this little piece here, or these little fancier ones, have like a little fluted piece. And so I just use these rubber stoppers in place of that. It also kind of helps me keep track of what side I'm working on when I come back later to pick it up. Like this one, you can see I've been working on it. I know that this is the end of my needle and that I start knitting my next row on this end. These are rubber, and they will wear out after a while, so they'll be kind of loose. They may not stay on the smaller gauges of your needles, you know, like the 1.75. So you may need to replace them, but they usually last through several projects. I also recommend finding a crochet hook, and you want something close, but it doesn't have to be as big as the diameter of the needle. And what this is to pick up any drop stitches, because when we're working with really small gauge knitting like this, it is easy to drop a stitch, especially when you're getting into decreases or increases. So this will help you just kind of pick up that stitch, put it back on the needle. When it comes to finishing your garment, you'll need a tapestry needle and an embroidery needle or blunt sewing needle. You don't want to use a sharp needle. And that's for finishing it and sewing the seams. And you'll want a pair of scissors. So those are your basic tools. And that's actually going to take me to the next thing I wanted to mention, which is some of the other tools you may want to have. This is a gauge. I want to kind of explain gauge. What gauge means is how many stitches across and how many rows make up a measurement. So advanced knitters know that everybody has a different tension. Some knitters knit very loosely, and they have a very loose tension on their fabric. Other knitters may knit very tightly. A lot of beginners have a tendency to knit tightly. They pull that yarn as tight as they can when they make their stitches. That can affect the size of your finished garment. So an experienced knitter knows, always do what we call a swatch test or a gauge. And what you're doing is you're knitting a certain number of rows and a certain number of stitches to make sure that you match what the writer or original maker did in their pattern. So ours is typically on a 2mm needle. It'll be like 10 stitches and 14 rows would make 1 inch of fabric. Because when you're knitting, you're literally making a fabric with one continuous thread. So, and if you've never used a particular yarn before, some yarns have more elasticity than others. So you always want to do a test swatch too to see how the yarn reacts or how it gives. Some of your threads can get kind of heavy and start to stretch as it gets, more rows as you work in. Some yarns can actually kind of spring back and they'll be shorter than you think they would be. So you may have to add rows, or you may have to add an extra stitch. I tried to design most of the pattern so it uses a 2mm diameter needle, and that's because that's the middle size in your average set of sock needles. And what that does is if you do your swatch and you find out that you knit tightly and that 14 rows is short of that 1 inch mark, you can move up to the next size needle size, like the 2.25, and then your gauge will match mine so that your finished object will be the same size as the sample. If you find out that you knit loosely and your swatch is much bigger, you have at least 2 sizes down that you can move so that your knitting matches the original size intended. And this is something, it's every maker, every publication, every publisher, you always want to do a swatch anytime it's a new material or it's a new pattern maker. So one of the questions I get the most, and especially from new knitters, is what yarn or fiber or thread should I buy? And it's kind of a complicated question. And really it depends on what do you want your finished garment to be. And we found this because this is how I actually got started. I wasn't knitting for 1/3 scale, I was actually knitting for 1/6 scale. And this little teeny tiny cardigan with its color work on its sleeves and the color work on its body has just as many stitches in it as this piece. The two differences are this uses a very thin thread and this uses a thin yarn, and this was made on the 0.75mm needles and this was made on 2mm needles. 0.75 and 2mm, that doesn't seem like a big difference, but again, that's how we can miniaturize our knitting. So I kind of wanted to show you guys kind of the collection that I have built. There are 2 kinds of materials that you can use in knitting. There are yarns and things that are labeled thread. Yarn is made of fibers. This can be either animal fibers, plant fibers, or it can be acrylic or synthetic. The hair on a sheep, the wool, say is this long. So what a spinner does is they take those and they overlap them end to end and then twist them to keep them together as one continuous length, and that's how you get yarn. One of these twists is called a ply, P-L-Y, and you need to know that because that's going to help you pick the best fiber for you to use. Typically you will see yarn described as 2-ply And what that means is they've actually taken two of these twisted threads and twisted them together against each other. And every time they do that, if they do a 2-ply, a 4-ply, it makes it stronger and it helps it keep its shape, because those little fibers, the woolly ones, are very elastic and they have a lot of what's called memory, and I'll explain that later. So it keeps it stronger. A 1-ply yarn is going to be a lot weaker and more susceptible to breakage than a 4-ply yarn. But the downside is, for us knitting in miniature, is the more plies, not only is the thread stronger, but it's stiffer, which means your piece is going to be bulkier. It's going to be not as drapey. And what I've got here is actually a really good example of that. This is baby alpaca and a little bit of a silk blend, and I'll explain what the silk's for later. But it is basically the same size as the one next to it. But you can see it's a lot drapier. It has what's called a softer hand. It's a little thinner, but you still get very good stitch detail. This one is made from a wool that was intended to be used for socks. It was a 2-ply yarn instead of this 1-ply yarn. And as you can see, it's not quite as drapey. I can't get as many teeny tiny folds. It's a little thicker, a little stiffer, and we do still get the good stitch detail, but there's a difference. Typically 2-ply is also referred to as baby yarn or sport weight yarn, or sometimes fingering weight can be a 2-ply. 4-ply, that's usually what you'll see referred to as DK, and that stands for double knit, or worsted weight. The 4-plies, that's going to be too thick. So we're going to stick around mostly 1- and 2-ply yarns. And I find that the animal fibers in yarn are softer and have more drape to them when you work with them. Some of the acrylics that are marked as lace yarn can work. This is a lace yarn from Lion brand, and it looks, when you look at it, it looks like it's very similar. It is a 2-ply yarn, and I can even pull it apart and you can see there's actually like 2 threads to it. But it has a lot of elasticity to it. They made the acrylic so that it's very soft. This sweater is done in this yarn. It's softer and more drapey than the wool of the same ply. Okay, but they are what's called a different weight. But it's not as soft or as drapey as this one. So that's why I suggest do the swatch, because some yarns have more elastic, they can still work. Some may be just as thin in diameter, but they're still going to work up thicker. There is also something for natural fibers called a halo. And we have three good examples of differing levels of halo. What is a halo? Halo is these little thin fibers that just kind of spread out from the core piece. This one has a very large halo. This one is a bit of a medium halo. You're still going to get that kind of fuzzy look. And the alpaca has very little halo. The reason this has a halo is because these are all considered lace yarns for lace work. Lace work is a type of knitting where you use very large needles, and it has kind of that spider web intricate look to it. What the halo does is those fibers will catch each other, and they'll lock that open work in place so that when you're wearing that scarf, all of those stitches aren't going to compact into one little place. They're going to felt together and they're going to hold their shape. Now, sometimes this can work in your favor, sometimes not. This one had a very thin thread, but it had a very large halo, so when I tried to knit with it, it came out very kind of lumpy and very stiff. This one, even though it looked like it was thicker, it actually worked better. And it's going to be a very fuzzy sweater. It's going to be a very chunky sweater, but it works. The thing about the halo is this one, the stripes will show, but I wouldn't be able to do a textured knit because you wouldn't be able to see the pattern very well. There's not a lot of what's called stitch definition. And I can kind of show the difference. On the one in the sock wool, you can see the individual V's that make up a stitch. In the swatch here, you can kind of see the rows, but you can't necessarily see individual V's. And if it's a stripe or a solid, that really doesn't make a big difference. But if I wanted to do something with texture like this cable knit, that fuzzy yarn would not work in the cable knit because you would not be able to see these stitches. The halo would blur those. So if I wanted to do a texture stitch like a cable, or if I wanted to do a knit, if I wanted to see a rib, I would pick something that has a low halo, that you don't see a lot of the fuzzies. It looks very smooth. Another class of materials that you can use to knit with is thread. Now, we talked about yarn is made of a ply, so 1 ply or 2 ply. Thread generally is going to be either braided or twisted. If you took it apart, you'd see that it's actually made of 3 yarn plies, if that makes sense. Threads also have a tendency to be made of plant fibers like cotton, bamboo, linen, so they don't have any halo. In the case of this, the crochet cotton and the DMC thread, they've also been what's called mercurized. And what they did is once they made the continuous length of thread, they ran it through a special treatment that took all of those little loose fibers from the linen or cotton that might have fuzzed out the yarn. So you get something that's very clean and kind of shiny, silky looking. These don't have a lot of elasticity or stretch. That will change how your finished object looks and how it fits. So once again, we had this one that was made out of the wool sock yarn. We have this one that's made out of the alpaca. And then these are made from thread. And this is actually made from a thinner cotton crochet thread. But as you can see, it doesn't have the same stretch or memory that the yarn does. This can work for you though. In this case, I wanted something that was very kind of open, as you can see through this. I wanted something that was very light for kind of a summer, coverall or something like that. So, and it did kind of change the dimensions because it doesn't have as much elasticity. I tended to knit tighter than I did with this one. So this one's actually a little shorter than this one. So I had to actually add a few rows to the sleeves to make sure that the sleeves still covered the same length. Some of the other things that you can use, like I showed you the DMC thread. Now these are called pearl cotton. It's not pearl like a bead or you know, from a clamshell. It's P-E-R-L-E. And it's a mercurized cotton. Now the DMC thread is a little softer than the crochet cotton, and it comes in numbered sizes. For threads, they come in numbered sizes rather than plies. And the higher the number, the thinner the thread. So this is a number 8, and this is a number 12, which is just a little bit thicker than twice a heavy sewing thread. And this one is, well, this is pretty close to an 8, but there's also something called a number 5, which is, well, roughly twice the diameter of this one. Crochet cottons in tatting threads will usually start at 30, 20, and then this is 10. So the fun part with this is I can get very delicate things. This one was actually made from a number 8 DMC thread, and with the ribbing it makes it kind of elastic, but when she puts it on, it's very sheer, it's very lacy, and it's very open. So you finished your sweater, you bound it off, and this isn't bad wings. We need to convert this into an actual wearable piece for our doll. So we need to finish it, and we need to make a couple of decisions. So one of those is going to be, do we want to block it or not? So earlier I mentioned that yarn has memory, and what that means is it's been spun and it's woven, and it has this memory that it's a piece of straight fiber. And what happens is, as you're knitting, especially stock knit stitch, which is when you do a row of knit and a row of purl, it has a tendency to want to curl, and you can really see it in this one. It kind of wants to curl sideways and kind of wants to roll up. So what we need to do is we need to reset the memory of the yarn so it'll lay flat. And to do that, we need to block it. And we need a few tools to do that. We need some pins and something to pin it to. And I just have a piece of really inexpensive foam, and I've been using this for a long time. It actually came in a 4-pack, so I can lay out larger items. And I have some T-pins. If it's a particularly fine knit piece, I might use like regular sewing pins. This is where you'll want to get out the wrapper that came, or sleeve that came on your fiber, because it's going to determine how we can block it. So we want to make sure that we look at our wrapper, and it will tell us if we can use an iron, or if we can use hot water or not. And most of them are pretty good. They have the little new international symbols for laundry. Like this one I can hand wash, and I think this one, on part of it, I think it actually said, yeah, it says, this one I can actually apply a steam iron to it, and I can hand wash it. This one says I need to make sure that the water is 30 degrees Celsius or cooler. So I want to make sure that if it says that it can't be washed, if it says it's dry clean only, which some of the silk yarns will say that, or the bamboo, that means I may be able to block it with steam. But if it says I can hand wash and it doesn't tell me the temperature, you usually want to use just kind of a tepid warm water. You don't want to use hot water, you don't want to use really cold water, because the cold water isn't going to help shock those fibers to block them, to reset that memory. if your oils from your hands, if you've been working on this for a while or that, it's kind of a pre-wash to get rid of those as well, and just clean it and get it ready. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to take this, you can use Woolite or mild detergent, and you'll just kind of put it in the water, let it soak, and you can kind of press, but we don't want to felt the sweater. We just want to make sure that all the fibers are wet with the warm water. And then you'll take it out of the water, you'll put it on a towel, preferably a clean white towel or something like that so there's no dye transfer, and fold it and roll it. You want to press the water out, you don't want to wring it, because again, the wringing might cause it to felt. There is another way to block a sweater if the care tag says that you can't get it fully submerged in water or it's a dry clean. And basically that one, you skip the step where we wet or soaked it and then pressed it dry. You take your sweater while it's dry and you go ahead and pin it so it's flat, and then you take the steam from an iron or a steamer and you just kind of hold it lightly over, and it should provide just enough heat and just enough moisture to reset the memory in the yarn without causing it to felt or shrink, to contract. So then you'll pull it out and you'll have a damp sweater. And then you can either use a felt board, which I have one of those, or you can use the foam. I like the foam because they seem to get more air circulation and it dries faster. And you want to block it out. What you want to do is you want to try to get it in the shape that it should be if you took it apart and laid it flat. We don't want to stretch our ribbing. We want to keep that kind of narrow because that rib stitch creates your elastic on your hems and on your collar. We want to make sure that our sleeves are flat, and then we just kind of take our pins and just keep it, just kind of roll it out gently, and then we let it dry overnight. And then when we come in the next day, we take the pins out and it'll be nice and flat, and it'll actually help us put it together. If this was a full-size sweater, usually what we do is we will sew the sweater together with the actual yarn that we made the sweater out of. The issue with this is remember, we're shrinking everything in scale, and what will happen is the yarn is kind of bulky and it'll add some bulk to the seam. And so if you have a seam here, it might create a ridge when the doll's wearing the item, or it might create a ridge down the center of the back. So what I have found that works better is I will actually take a blunt sewing needle or an embroidery needle, and I'll take a matching sewing thread, and I will do a mattress stitch or a ladder stitch. You just kind of go from side to side. With the sewing thread, if it matches, if you don't know how to do a mattress stitch or you're not real comfortable with it, you can do a whip stitch. And what you'll do is you'll actually just try to grab with that sewing needle the outermost stitch on that side, and then the outermost stitch on the other side, making sure that you keep them even. And I usually work from the hem to the armpit on a sweater, and then from the sleeve hem to the armpit, and then I can tie off the ends of my sewing thread in the armpit, and I can leave a little bit. That helps secure the knot so you don't end up with a hole. But if something were to happen and the stitch came loose, it'll be much easier to kind of repair that little hole up in the armpit where it's not going to show. And if the doll's wearing the dress, they're not going to see those threads, versus if you tried to weave in. So, but you will need a needle to weave in your ends, and basically that's just going diagonally through your stitches. You don't weave. You would, like this one, I would come up through the stitches this way and then back down, and what that does is that just secures the end of the thread. I can trim off the excess and it won't unravel. So that was just some of the most common questions I get. some of the tips and hints and things that I've learned working in scale knitting. I am an intermediate level knitter. I am not an expert. My word is not rule or law. I'm sure there are some exceptions, or I may have missed something. If you do have any questions that I didn't answer in the video, or you need some clarification because I touched on something but didn't quite explain it fully, do leave your questions or comments below. I will read those. I will try to answer them in the comment section so that others can see them as well. If you have any specific questions, you know, maybe about a specific pattern or something, go ahead and send us an email. I do try to respond to those as quickly as I can. If you have some questions or something that you would like to see clarified, I may do another video and we can go over those then. Okay. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for your patience with me. Please enjoy your day, and I'd love to see your projects if you do try to take on one of these little miniature sweaters or whatever for your smart doll. Thanks. Bye guys.